I was a courier for a medical company specializing in DNA tests for people in maximum security prisons. These companies needed somebody to ferry the samples between the prisons and the testing facility, which, surprisingly, they did not have on site. So, that was me. I was on the road for hours at a time, carting these samples all over the state of Colorado. It paid really well, but your entire life was spent on the road. So, unless you liked driving all the time, it might not be the gig for you. Plus, the company is really particular about how you get to your destination. If your mileage goes out of a certain range, they get critical. Things got to the point where I really felt like I needed an extra break. I figured that if I can find a way to get where I was going to faster, I could sit down for coffee or something for the amount of time that I shaved. I started paying attention to different sections of the road at a time, running things through GPS and the like, and before too long, I found a way to shave off about 25 minutes. All I had to do was cut through this little rural town that was barely big enough to even be marked on the map. When I got to take a break at McDonald's, I felt like a genius. I promised myself that I would only do that a couple of times, but I got into the habit of doing nearly every day. I knew they were going to catch me somehow, but I just didn't care. I liked getting that extra break in. Plus, I really liked seeing that little town. Around autumn, I noticed an oddity about the place. It had a church that was made entirely out of old wood and was planted in front of a thriving pumpkin patch. The place was so old that you would think it would fall over any minute. It was impossible to tell if it was entirely abandoned or not. I wondered if the patch was used but the church wasn't. I decided that one day I would spend my spare 25 minutes checking the place out. By then, I'd gotten in my fair share of illicit breaks on the daily. Missing one in the name of little adventures would be worth it. So I drove through my little town as usual, made sure there wasn't anybody around, parked in front of the pumpkin patch in the church's bare dirt parking lot. There were some hints that at one point, in time, it had been a gravel parking lot, but the passage of time had swallowed all the rocks down deep into the earth. It was quite a sight, seeing that rickety church, barely standing, surrounded by large fat pumpkins. I could have saved myself a world of trouble if I'd turned around and gone about my way at that point, because I truly had seen enough. But I don't know. I was very curious. I mean, if you found a church surrounded by pumpkins, wouldn't you want to know how it looked on the inside? I did, at least. The front door appeared to be unlocked. I imagined that if there was any lock on it at all, it probably rotted off decades ago. The outside light coming through the stained glass was enchanting, but the stained glass was rather peculiar. They didn't depict anything that I would normally associate with traditional Christianity. They were depictions of things that felt a little more esoteric, representations of goblets. One of them was next to a dagger, and I kid you not, the central stained glass window behind the pulpit or the altar, the biggest one in the place, had several depictions of pumpkins. That's when I noticed that the pews were full of them. They weren't growing in there. They had all been placed in there. Gentle lights flickered from inside of them, feeble rays wriggling out through carved openings. I've seen some terrifying jack-o'-lantern carvings in my time, but these were horrific. It's not that they were complicated, or any of these carvings would have been seen in a competition. As far as technical skill, they were simple. But even with that simplicity, they were pure fear and terror and horror, distilled down to common denominators, to the point that I felt the hair on my arm and on my neck standing on end. Then, there's that question that always occurs to a person who sees a jack-o'-lantern. Was it a real candle or an electric one? I approached the nearest pumpkin, and I could tell you that's something that should have not been done. Inside was a real candle, but it was what was sitting on top of that became my focus. At first, I thought it was fake, a very well done fake, but having become aware of its presence, that in turn made me aware of the smell of rot, which can only mean that the severed or mutilated head inside the pumpkin was real. The candle was perched atop its forehead, right between the eyes. Actually, it only had one eye. It was clouded and papery, with the other socket was a yawning empty gap. I was about to dismiss myself from this church when it sounded like a wrecking ball slammed into the wall from the outside. I think that's about the closest I ever came to about passing out and messing my pants at the same time. The crashing sound came several more times, and it sounded like the wooden planks were not holding up under stress. Then, it sounded like something was literally climbing the walls from the outside. Something very large and misshapen passed in front of the stained glass window behind the altar. Was it an ape? It couldn't have been. Apes don't growl like panthers. And then I heard hushed speech, like somebody was scolding a dog, as quietly as possible. The commotion continued on the roof, while somebody outside was getting increasingly impatient, telling whatever it was to calm down, get off the roof. I knew instinctively that if I didn't take my chance then, I was not going to get another one. I felt danger. I ran through the first door, knocking a couple of bodies out of my way. People that were wearing ragged brown robes, like somebody took bags from a shipment of coffee and tried to make them into clothing, like burlap or sackcloth. This was only a peripheral perception. I was booking it to my car. Miraculously, I got on the driver's side, got my door shut, and got it locked without being stopped. Some large shape leaped off of the roof of the church and landed on the roof of the cab of my car. The impact was like that of thunder. I got my car started, peeled out of there, causing whatever was on the top to roll off and hit the ground behind me. I never exactly got a clear look at what it was, and I'm probably better off for it. I never cut through that small town anymore. I have difficulty sleeping at night because, everybody knows that a real cult will hunt you down. They saw my license plate, so I'm dreading the day that they track me down, and whatever that horrible thing was, they use it to kill me. It hasn't happened yet, but it won't surprise me if it does. Back in 1987, I used to be a teacher in Colorado. I've taught many elementary school grades, but my favorite to teach was second grade. The students to me were at a stage where they were more like people than mere babies, and fun to interact with. I never became the career entertainer that I wanted to, but I channeled that through my own teaching, with puppets and an assortment of voices that I could do. Plus, I had an ability to draw that I saved for the overhead projector. The 80s saw quite an explosion of those toys that were talking animals. You put a cassette tape in the back of the animal, and it brought the toy to life. When the classroom was especially good, I would treat them to a regular session of story time on Fridays with a talking Mother Goose toy. And the class was usually pretty well behaved, at least for me. It wasn't unusual for me to have to go away on a trip or something, come back from the trip, and get an earful from the substitute that was hired. The first time that a substitute went off on me for how poorly behaved the class was in my absence, I almost thought he was talking about a completely different classroom, and I wondered if he had ended up in the wrong classroom, while my own classroom remained unattended all day, every day that I was gone. But after several more subs giving me the same report, I understood that it was indeed my kids. So, the time came again for me and my wife to take a little trip for us and ourselves and get away from our everyday work lives. So I made sure to be extra prepared for whoever would have to teach for the kids. I filled the sub in on the library of entertainment tools that I had been stashing away in the classroom, not the least of which was the talking Mother Goose. Her eyes lit up when she had heard what I had, because she said that she had several tapes for that very toy, some of which were very rare. If I hadn't been pressed for the time, I would have sat down and chatted with her, because I thought that I had every single tape the manufacturer ever made. But at the time, I was glad to hear that she was both prepared and enthusiastic for the task ahead. I also made it a point to call in several times during my absence to the classroom, just to ask how things were going. It would also be an excuse to see if I could hear the kids in the background. Every time I called, not only did the sub say that things were going just fine, it sounded like it was quiet in there, and that you could hear a pin drop. I didn't hear a single voice. I took that as a testimony to the teacher's skills and preparation. So, after 3 calls that went just like that, I decided to leave her alone and let her do her job without me hovering over her. That way, I could pay 100% attention to the vacation and to my wife. The transition of coming back to the classroom was smooth. If I didn't know any better, I'd say the kids were even quieter than they were before I left. I think she could even tell how bewildered I was, and she looked rather proud of herself. I told her that I was definitely going to be using her in the future. That was by far the best experience I had ever had with the sub. So, I stood in front of the class and told everybody good morning. The kids kind of stared at me blankly. I usually got really enthusiastic, greeting whenever I came back from the trip. But this time, I got nothing. I tried to ignore the weight forming in my stomach, and I tried to get the kids to open up about their experience with the sub. After too long of a pause, a hand went up in the back. The kids said that they listened to the cassette tapes, a lot in the Mother Goose toy. I asked them what stories she played for them with Mother Goose. That's when the classroom lit up with enthusiasm. What I was able to piece together from the eager blabbering was that they listened to one story over and over every day. I was hoping that was an exaggeration, but apparently, all of their classroom time was taken up with this one story. They said it was a very long story, and it lasted the entire day. She would have to pause the story for them to go to lunch and recess, and then come back and finish the story in time for them to go home. They said it was some story called The Lion and the Lotus. As for whatever the story was about, I could not get a clear answer to save myself. Every answer I got was gibberish. I decided to leave the topic alone for the moment and come back to it later. I gave them a very easy assignment to take care of while I got my desk and my papers and everything else in order. I took out the Mother Goose toy to prepare an extra story for them since they had been so well behaved. When I popped the cassette door open, I found that there was already a cassette already in there. And what do you know? It was labeled The Lion and the Lotus, a plain black cassette with the title written on a strip of masking tape. I turned the volume way down and pressed play. I heard a terrible groaning sound, as something malfunctioned in Mother Goose. Sparks flew, and the stink of burning, plushy fabric filled the air. I hurried, turning the toy off and popping the cassette tape out, expecting to see it completely chewed up. It was perfectly fine. Only that time I looked closer. The cassette tape was empty. There was no magnetic lead running from reel to reel. It was the tape that she had been playing for the classroom in my absence every single day. What had they been listening to?